Hi, Robin. Hi, Musharraf, and hi, Matt. I don't think we've met in real life yet.
Hi, nice to meet you here.
Oh, I was on mute, so I'll start all over again. Welcome everyone to Tabadlab Live. We're super excited to do this kind of special smaller roundtable on the outcome of the U.S. election and specifically what that outcome will do to American foreign policy and how that'll be felt around the world. And we have, I think, a super exciting group of folks to talk to about this. We're honored to be joined by Her Excellency, former ambassador and longtime State Department senior vizier, Robin Raphel. It's so great to have you with us, Robin. And you look incredibly fresh for how early it is, especially given COVID times. So congrats on being so up and about. Jonah Blank is joining us, and Jonah is currently in Singapore, so it's super late there. But many thanks for making time. Jonah spent almost a lifetime at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's a very well-respected and highly regarded scholar on international relations, on security, and on various parts of the world, but particularly East Asia. And because he was on the Foreign Relations Committee, of course, everyone that's ever touched that thing is a South Asia expert. So welcome, Jonah. And last but definitely not least, Matt Duss, who was helping shape Senator Bernie Sanders's presidential campaign in terms of foreign policy. Matt is a fixture in and around the Beltway, but in the best way possible as a progressive, because he's not part of the architecture, but rather one of those that challenges it. And maybe, without me saying much more, because we're already 3 minutes in, and I want to speak the least among the four, although I know it'll be a challenge. Matt, I want to start with you because this victory, I have written this, and I strongly believe this is not an affirmation or an endorsement of the Democratic Party and its agenda, whatever that agenda is, and it's definitely not a big shift in kind of the U.S. place in the world. I think that the vote for Biden is essentially a not for Trump vote. And what that means is that progressives like yourselves, AOC, the whole range of the squad and all the progressive voices in the Democratic Party, that I feel like it may be very unlikely that your voice, especially on foreign policy, will be a big one in a Biden administration. How wrong am I?
Well, first of all, I'm a little hurt that you didn't notice how fresh I look. I'm also up early, so just wanted to get that out there. But no, thank you for that, and it's great to be here with you. I mean, first to the first remark, I think it did. The election does show that this country is extremely polarized, almost evenly, though. Thank goodness, from my point of view, not completely. Joe Biden did win, I think, a substantial margin. It could be as high as 6 to 7 million votes. But Donald Trump also got a record number of votes for himself. So I think there's some truth to what you're saying about this, Biden winning a large anti-Trump vote. There was some ticket splitting with even people who voted against Donald Trump did vote down ballot for Republicans in Congress. Or Democrats didn't make nearly the gains that they wanted to in Congress, to say the very least. But I also, in terms of progressives and the influence on foreign policy, I think it's clear, Biden, there are some differences, I think, in Biden's foreign policy agenda from where progressives are, but I think there are also some very important areas of consensus. And the Biden team has, from the very beginning, when Biden kind of sealed up the nomination, made a really genuine, both public and private outreach to progressive policy teams, to the other candidates teams, to our team, to Senator Sanders, and has remained, I think, pretty robustly engaged with progressives on issues including foreign policy. I mean, the last thing I'll say here is also I would be hesitant to characterize. I mean, I think it's important to note that some of the the things that Donald Trump, even though I think he's kind of, his foreign policy has been certainly erratic. He'll say one thing one day and then he'll tweet something at 3 a.m. in the morning that's disconcerting to a lot of people. And I think we'd all probably agree that's no way to run foreign policy. I think some of the kind of long-term so-called consensus issues that he called into question, I mean, these discussions are going to continue into the future. This is a discussion within the Democratic Party and, between the parties and just in the foreign policy community more broadly about America's role in the world, about the extent of our military presence, about the amount we spend, what we expect from allies and partners. So I would be hesitant to characterize this as just kind of a progressives versus centrist issue.
Well, clearly, Matt, today, I think it was today, but, given the time differences across the four of us, it might be yesterday or, earlier today. Rand Paul tweeted something about thanking President Trump about something. I don't know if all three of you are aware, but for the viewers' benefit and for the three of you, if I'm not mistaken, it was a congratulatory note from Rand Paul to the president for essentially beheading the Pentagon in service of a quicker and more complete withdrawal from Afghanistan. I had honestly planned to spend about an hour talking about more general things and then come to the region. But Robin, why not just get into it right now? This Afghanistan thing, many of us outside the United States see being in or outside Afghanistan as kind of a done deal. It seems like the reality is that it's a lot more complex within DC and within the foreign policy establishment, of which now people like Rand Paul are a substantial part.
Well, thank you very much, Musharraf. And again, pleasure to be here, even if early in the morning. And very nice to be with colleagues again. Look, I think the Rand Paul tweet you were talking about might have been his congratulating Trump on appointing Doug McGregor to a position in the Pentagon, along with this whole reshuffle and firing of Esper and so on and so forth. And McGregor is very well known for his very strong views on getting U.S. troops out of the Middle East and particularly out of Afghanistan. So there certainly is a concern, and there's been a concern even before these new appointments, that in these next couple of months that Trump would move quickly to make good on his promise to bring U.S. troops home. This is concerning. I know it's very concerning to the U.S. team who've been working so diligently for the last couple of years to try and get a political resolution before U.S. troops leave Afghanistan. As to how quickly he might be able to do that, or whether that's really the reason he made these switches, is thus far a little bit difficult to tell. I know that people in the Pentagon and commanding officers are, have some ability to slow roll these decisions, shall we say. I'm trying to put this delicately. But I think there is a concern that this could further stall and imbalance and make more difficult the negotiations going on in Doha.
So, Robin, again, it's a really interesting debate because there's so many assumptions about various countries' positions, and one of the fears that I have, Jonah, is that a lot of the memory, the institutional memory that people carry, it's really hard to shed. So, if, for example, if I have the perception that Pakistan, the Pakistani establishment wants the Americans out of Afghanistan, which is factually untrue as of today, given Pakistan's interest in stability in Afghanistan. But I may have this memory because I've been doing this for a while, just like you have, and Matt has, and Robin has. Do you have a fear that some of the people that are going to come into a Biden administration are going to be carrying the burden of their memory from 08 to 16? How much of a concern would that be? Obviously, everybody involved would have remained relatively current in terms of engaged with the issues, but being inside and being outside the system 4 years is a really long time.
Yeah, I don't really have that concern. I should say that even though I have provided advice to the team around my old boss, I don't speak for the campaign. I don't speak for my old boss. I'm just speaking for myself. But I'm not worried about whoever may come in, because I really do think that it's going to be looked at in a very professional way. The question isn't going to be, how do we get out of Afghanistan? Because I think that President Biden is going to want to make that happen while maintaining regional stability. The tricky part, as Robin has quite rightly said, is how you do that. And, does that mean that only combat troops are withdrawn, but there still is a force left for counterterrorism missions, for training of the Afghan National Security Forces? Does it mean that all U.S. troops of all sorts are withdrawn? If that were the case, then chances are the U.S. presence would have to be withdrawn completely, including the diplomatic and intelligence presence. And I'm not sure that that's where the decision is going to go. But I do have confidence that the people who will be making these decisions will be making them on facts in 2021, not facts in 2008 or 2012.
Yeah, I think that's reassuring, because I know how well you know the system and how well you know the president-elect, having spent as long as you did on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I want to keep this going and keep it sort of, I really love the fact that you guys were so brief, because usually we have people that like to go on for a bit, but I love how quick that was. Matt, I've been thinking about what's going to be different, and as a cynical, or maybe not cynical, but certainly skeptical sort of non-American, I think, okay, so on Afghanistan, the U.S. is going to get out, and I guess the big debate, as we just discussed, is really going to be around how quickly and with what residual, but is leaving. So roughly, it's kind of, in Urdu we say, 19-20 ka fark. It's the difference between 19 and 20. I know that'll sound unfair and a little bit harsh, but maybe let's talk about a different part of the world, not too far away, but China, which seems to be one of the biggest sort of issues in the public discourse, at least. How will a Biden administration be different from the Trump administration on China, and which direction will a progressive like yourself be trying to pull the administration in within that sort of distinction?
Sure, thanks. And a couple things. One is Jonah did remind me that I also wanted to just clarify that I'm here speaking in my own capacity and not for Senator Sanders. And I also want to have a brief comment about Afghanistan before I take the opportunity to address China, because I think, as I was saying in my first remark, it is important to note the way that both the parties now, Donald Trump, even though the Republican Party didn't actually have a formal platform this year, they just had, I guess, a memo that Donald Trump, dictated at some point. But he has talked about himself as, the one who, wanting to end endless wars. He has said this numerous times. It was in that platform that he put out. The Democratic Party platform also includes a commitment to end the forever war. This has been a long time progressive priority, but it's also a conservative priority. I think there is a strong level of popular support for drawing down, the kind of post 9/11 global war on terror interventions. I think there's an understanding that this needs to be done responsibly in a way that leads to more stability, not less stability, but still. America has been in Afghanistan for nearly 20 years now. It's the country's longest war in our history. We're still there on the basis of a 2001 authorization that many would argue is no longer valid, and in any case needs to be seriously reassessed. Maybe it needs to be replaced, but it needs to be reassessed. And I think this issue of authorization and Congress reasserting its authority over war, which is something that you saw behind Senator Sanders' Yemen War Powers Resolution and Senator Kane's Iran War Powers Resolutions, is something that we're going to continue to see during a Biden administration. Now, I think with regard to China, I think it's
before you get into China, Matt, you don't mind? I just because I think this is really interesting. So I understand the kind of or rather, I appreciate the internal mechanics of presidential power versus congressional power, the limitations of the American appetite for war. But there's another angle to this, and I know you follow this extremely closely. A lot of Afghans who are essentially a product of this post 9/11 period, who are urban, who have a very clear and comprehensive understanding of their rights and of their place in the world. Young women, Afghan women in particular, they sort of ask a lot of Pakistanis for different reasons, but I think they're also starting to ask a lot of Americans, hey, we understand you don't want to be at war anymore, but do you realize what you're going to leave behind in terms of human rights and female mobility, access to education, access to doctors? We remember what the Taliban period was like. How do progressives sort of deal with that element of the question when it comes to wanting to withdraw from Afghanistan?
No, I think it's a great point, and I think as a progressive, we understand that we do have obligations on those issues. We are not neutral on the issue of human rights, on women's rights, on girls' rights to go to school. So that's certainly going to factor in to the debate and the policy that we'll support. But I think part of this is just kind of trying to prise open a much more vigorous discussion about when and how and in what scenarios and under what authorities America continues to use military violence, and what can that violence actually achieve. I think we need to have a really, a tough debate about what have we achieved after nearly 20 years in Afghanistan. But I think you're quite right to bring up, we need to understand what we are leaving behind, and not simply push to withdraw just for the sake of withdrawing. But at the same time, we do need to withdraw. We need to draw this war to a close. But that doesn't mean simply picking up and leaving.
So that's this idea of not picking up and leaving and responsibilities brings me to another question. Again, this is not an attribution to Biden, the Biden of today, but if I try to kind of roll back my memory, Robin, and you may remember this as well, although you can contest this if you like, my recollection is that Biden was entirely non-surge. He was against the surge. Before the West Point speech, he was decidedly kind of in favor of what would today be the progressive position, which is that, yes, there are some issues with the state of human rights and what have you, but this is not a problem America is going to be able to solve, certainly not through an enhanced intervention or a massive surge as the Coinistas wanted to engage in. As the U.S. leaves this region, one of the questions as a Pakistani for me is what impact it'll have on strategic balance and equilibrium. To what extent and again, I'm framing this as a Pakistani, and again, I'm very happy for you to contest this, but the adventurous instinct of India, and we've already seen that with respect to Balakot, and if we don't want to call it adventurism, let's call it aggression, territorial aggression. Notwithstanding what triggered the Balakot attack, but something like that happening with 5,000-6,000 U.S. troops nearby versus without. Am I over dramatizing and overemphasizing the role of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, or do you think that's going to be a factor in the thinking of the incoming Biden administration?
Okay, well, you've put a lot of things on the table there, Musharraf. Let me back up a bit to where you started. Biden certainly was against the surge and was against a long involvement in Afghanistan. Jonah, I'm sure, knows more about his thinking in that regard, but he definitely publicly held that position. Let me make another point about the U.S. troop presence in Afghanistan, as it has been and even as it still is today. I'm a strong believer that we need to withdraw, but not because of the expense or even the blood in addition to the treasure, but because the presence that we've had hasn't actually helped solve the problem. And I would argue now that the troops are an obstacle that needs to be managed. and the troops need to eventually be withdrawn. But at the same time, and this is really important, and I do believe the Biden administration folks will understand this, we need a very robust political, economic, diplomatic engagement in Afghanistan. We should not get smaller in terms of our civilian footprint. And, you know, the theory is, and I realize it won't work out perfectly, but when you take the major combatants off the battlefield, that there will be more flexibility for civilians to move around and so on. This is not a sort of we leave and chaos ensues. That is the whole point of trying to negotiate a political deal between the government and the Taliban. So I think that's really important. I also am of the view, and not everybody shares this at all, but I am of the view that once you get a political discussion and settlement near, that it could become quite clear that the new government, whatever it is, could in fact ask the United States for some assistance on the military side. I mean, I sort of flippantly often say, you know, the core of the U.S. Taliban deal was that there would be guarantees that Afghanistan couldn't be used to shelter extremists who could attack America and its allies again. Thus far, that doesn't seem to be the case. You know, seeing a lot of these attacks, you have lots of groups moving around, and neither the Taliban nor the Afghan government, with the assistance of U.S. forces, has been able to shut all that down. So I think there would be an argument for a new Afghan government to invite the U.S. and international forces in a modest way to stay in a counterterrorism assistance mission there. Now, you know, if the Taliban would never say that publicly and so on, but I think that is a possibility in the future. And, you know, so that there wouldn't be a total vacuum. As to the India side, you know, you make a good point, but that's the India issue is a whole other issue, and how the Biden administration will handle that. So perhaps you want to, you know, pass the football to someone else on that right now.
I certainly I will, and actually we don't have to spend too much time on India because I think there's so many more interesting things about this transition. One of them is this, you know, just sticking to Afghanistan a little bit, Dr. Blank. I think, you know, I'm not surprised in a snarky way, but I guess I feel a little bit less optimistic about what's going to happen there as compared to Ambassador Raphel. I feel like there is a lot of reminiscence from what I've collected from, you know, the literature and talking to people who are around during the Geneva Accords and the way that things kind of started falling apart. And then we saw, you know, I mean, eventually culminating in the formation of the Taliban and then their takeover. What is your perspective on this? What happens after, let's say, Biden and the administration come in, everything goes smoothly in Washington. The progressives are happy, the conservatives are happy. President Biden has a clear plan. There's an exit, and then what next? Do you see it more the way that Ambassador Raphel sees it, or are you more pessimistic in the way that perhaps I am, that things are going to fall apart relatively quickly?
Well, Musharraf, I hate to say I am a little bit pessimistic about how this plays out in Afghanistan itself. I'm more optimistic about it being handled professionally and intelligently in Washington. But one of the things that the past 20 years should have shown us is that Washington doesn't really call the shots in Afghanistan. Washington can make things a lot worse and may be able to make things a little better, but the US does not really dictate events. The Soviet Union learned that, the United States learned that, and I think that lesson is one truism that will hold over. A couple of things that may provide some context. Since I was Senator Biden's staffer responsible for South and Southeast Asia on the Foreign Relations Committee from 1999 until 2009. So I've sort of, at least I've seen how this has developed. And it is worth remembering that the initial impetus for going into Afghanistan with troops, rather than just a massive air campaign that would have killed a lot of Afghans, but not actually done anything to make Afghan lives better. The impetus was coming from progressives. I was there at the time, and the feminist majority were one of the strongest advocates pushing for ground troops and for an actual diplomatic as well as military engagement that was at the time quite controversial. I also was with then Chairman Biden, Vice President-elect Biden, in January 2009, when we were in Kabul, and he really solidified his views, as he's spoken about publicly, that there just was not a good outcome here on the basis of our strategy for the past 10 years. And he was ahead of the curve on that. He was very much not looking to prolong what he saw as a failing strategy. So where does that leave us in 2021? It leaves me relatively optimistic that this will be handled with intelligence and care in Washington. It leaves me somewhat pessimistic about the impact in Afghanistan itself, because my earliest experience with this issue actually dates to when I lived in Afghanistan in 1997 or 98. I'd have to go back and think when I was last doing my anthropological field work. But during Taliban times, when you could drive through the Khyber Pass, and it would be a pretty stark transition when you went from Peshawar through right almost right up to Jalalabad is where you could get without actually crossing the checkpoint. And I've seen it throughout this period. And on the one hand, I do believe that President Ashraf Ghani is a far, far better partner than we ever had during the Hamid Karzai years. But I also, I'd be lying if I felt that that the future is going to be written by anyone other than the Afghans.
There's so much to unpack there, Jonah. Of course, the January 2009 trip that you talk about is, at least for me, the stuff of legend, because on the one hand, there was the table banging and walking out of the room moment with President Karzai. On the other, there was the holding hands moment with General Ashfaq Pervez Kiani and General Ahmed Shuja Pasha, who was the head of the ISI. And they held hands with Joe Biden when Joe Biden looked deep into their eyes and said, "Do we have the same enemy?" Of course, the relationship between Chairman Biden, Vice President Biden, and now President-elect Biden and Pakistan is something that, of course, I'm deeply interested in. But I do want to come back to that really last, because I think so many other factors will shape this incoming administration's relationship with Pakistan. And going back to China, Matt, I wanted, I know I interrupted you, but I thought that Afghanistan segue was really useful. And of course, I thought it really was. What is the China position that you think is likely to be adopted by this administration? How will it be different from Trump, and in what direction will progressives be pulling President Biden?
Well, I think, as he has done on a number of issues. I mean, Trump has kind of laid bare some concerns that a lot of Americans have had with regard to China, the loss of jobs in particular. But yet, I mean, the kind of belligerent policy, or at least the kind of toggling back and forth from belligerence and friendliness and friendly phone calls with Xi, but then attacking them over, over trade and obviously over the pandemic. And it's been really of note, impressive for me to watch, and slightly scary, how quickly China has kind of moved into to be the main focus of the foreign policy community. And I think there's a danger of promoting this, and this is not news. It's just as this new great power conflict around which the American people must unite. Now, obviously, I think the Biden administration will recognize Biden and his team have recognized China represents a considerable challenge or set of challenges. There are also areas in which we must work with China, climate change in particular. I mean, China has its own interests in working with the United States and the international community on issues like climate change. But I think even if we're not going to see the belligerence, thank goodness, that we've seen from Trump, I think we will see a lot of focus on China and some very, very deep thinking about how to confront that. And I think the concern is from progressives, and we saw some of this, during the campaign. I think this was probably April or May when you saw, I think, initially an ad from the Biden campaign that really hit Trump hard over, I forget what the language was. It was like bowing to the Chinese or something like that. And a lot of progressive groups had a concern with that it was kind of buying into the usual conservative hawkish framing of these issues. It was, could dangerously promote xenophobia and anti-Chinese sentiment. And I think they heard that. I think that you did see a shift in their rhetoric after that, which I think was good. Because I think there is a way to kind of talk responsibly about the real, valid challenges that China represents, but to do so in a way that doesn't, buy into this xenophobia, that doesn't play into the hawkish framing that I think a lot of conservatives prefer. And I think progressives were happy to see that. So I think that's going to be a characteristic of this debate.
One of the sort of informants of the thing that Matt talked about, this sudden adoption of China as the bad guy, and the really stark sort of a focus that so many in DC have adopted or adapted with respect to China. I think part of it is also, again, maybe not to be too pro-China, but in a sense, the US started withdrawing from its role as the driver of a rules-based international order. One example of that, and again, this is personal, others are free to contest it, but contest this. But the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, for example, completely against the run of play or norms in the international order that we've taken for granted for decades. That kind of behavior by the US, and obviously a lot of it took place under President Trump, but that enabled President Xi to, for example, go to Davos during the Trump era and essentially claim the mantle of the guardianship of the multilateral and rules-based international order. Now, we know, of course, that the way those rules would be interpreted through a Chinese lens, and particularly a Communist Party Chinese lens, would be very different. And I guess my question is, to what extent is the Biden administration likely to go all in on reclaiming that role at the head of the table, as President Biden himself wrote for Foreign Affairs back in April? Because it seems to me that whilst that would be the instinct of kind of a centrist, establishment figure like Biden, there are plenty in the U.S., both on the right, like Rand Paul, and on the left, like AOC, that will say, hold on a second, we have a healthcare crisis, an infrastructure crisis, a social crisis. We need to pay more attention at home. How do you think this balance is going to play out, and where will it land under President Biden?
Challenging question. We definitely did cede a lot of ground, not only to Beijing, but also, I would argue, to Moscow and a lot of other places in the last 4 years. And I assume that the Biden administration will want to begin to turn that around. But I think there's a certain sensitivity and understanding that we can't just, jump into the chair at the head of the table and say, we're back. It will be a more gradual process than that. But I think an essential process. I'm hoping with China, that the sort of confront, compete, and cooperate mantra will come to the forefront. As Matt was saying, there are things that we need to cooperate with China on. not only climate, but also the next pandemic. And I think we all accept that there will be one. So there, you've got the cooperation space there. But we also have to figure out how to compete. And I know that people have been, even in this administration, at work on that whole issue with China and the Belt and Road Initiative and 5G and all the rest of it. We really need to consider how we compete in that space, whether it's physical infrastructure or cyber infrastructure or whatever. So we need to move in that direction. And I also think we need to consider, and this is part of the competition piece, how we relate to countries like Pakistan, countries in Africa that have, and Asia, who've taken Chinese loans and so on and so forth on a major scale, and what that means for their future financial stability. I don't think it does any good to scold countries or to scold China for, debt trap diplomacy and all the rest of it, but rather to help countries seriously assess their portfolios and how to move forward in that regard. How the balance will turn out, I mean, I have confidence that Biden's foreign policy team will be mature, will be nuanced, and will be very professional in figuring out what this balance is. There's no turning back on the recognition, which was a long time coming, that China was going to be our chief competitor in the 21st century. People have known that, haven't grappled as dramatically as the Trump administration did. But in many ways, I think the Biden administration can be thankful to the Trump administration for at least putting that on the table openly, and now they can grapple with it more responsibly.
Matt, did you?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted very briefly, Musharraf, to your comment just now when you referenced AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and wanting to focus on domestic issues, and I do think I would just caution against talking about this in terms of progressives who want to focus on domestic issues at the expense of foreign policy. I think what we are seeing now is understanding that we have some very serious political cleavages in this country. We talked about the polarization. We have longstanding issues of racial, of white supremacy that we need to deal with, as we saw in this massive uprising and protest movement in the summer in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And that in order to have an actually effective foreign policy that's based on a real and durable consensus, it's absolutely essential to deal with some of these domestic issues, political issues such as health care, criminal justice, a whole range of issues. So it's not an either or situation. It's just an understand. And I think you see this reflected in the way that President-elect Biden has talked about these issues. If you look at his foreign affairs piece that was published last year and I think republished this year, he talks very, very clearly about this, the need to address some of these issues at home in order to be able to have to develop and execute an effective foreign policy. So I don't think it's an issue of should the United States remain globally engaged or not. I think there's a strong consensus in the Democratic Party that we should. The question is, using what tools and on what basis. But first of all, in order to have the real conversation, to develop the consensus necessary, we need to address some of these real and enduring domestic issues.
I hear that loud and clear, and I guess that's a great sort of setup for what I wanted to ask Jonah. I've referred to him several times as centrist, and I really think that he is. Not only is he centrist, but I think his administration and his persona is going to be the most important centrist figure maybe that we've ever experienced because of the nature of polarity globally and locally. The big question for me is how does that affect his thinking from a values and a norms perspective? Because what Matt just talked about in terms of domestic issues, I think it gets, it applies abroad as well. In Brazil, you have a president, we have a president. Brazil is a really important country for the world. And the kind of presidency that Brazil has frankly, I think Americans don't know anything in terms of toxicity vis-a-vis Trump compared to Bolsonaro and his administration in Brazil. You have Viktor Orban. You have the leadership in the Philippines. Again, notwithstanding my prejudices, but President Modi is Prime Minister Modi is frankly, every word that the Pakistanis use isn't acceptable to Americans, but surely he's a person of concern. How much of the approach of Biden will be driven by realpolitik and centrist realism, and how much of it will be driven by values? Because it'll seem pretty weird to be driven by values at home, but be driven by interests, in New Delhi, for example.
Yeah, that's a great question, Musharraf. Let me set the India piece aside for right now, because as Robin noted earlier, essentially that's a whole other segment, and I'm delighted to talk about that, but I don't want to have that push out the excellent question you've raised. And what I think is important to know is that Joe Biden really is a guy for whom values are core. He wouldn't have let me pitch human rights and value-driven progressive ideas to him for a decade if he didn't want this to be on his plate. To give you an example, one of the things I feel extremely deeply about is torture. I feel that one of the things that makes me most embarrassed as an American is the fact that during the Bush administration, we engaged in torture. And I would not have been able to remain in government if my boss at the time, Joe Biden, had not taken a strong stand against that. In the Southeast Asia part of my portfolio, I did some work in Cambodia. I came back with photographs of waterboards used by the Khmer Rouge, presented them to Joe Biden, and said, look, here is the actual thing that Dick Cheney is saying is not torture. And Joe Biden took those pictures, brought them to the floor of the Senate to denounce the actions that were being taken in all of our names. At the same time, he does have a very well-developed sense of what is realistic and what isn't. Is the government of China engaged in massive human rights violations against the Uyghur population, its Uyghur population in Xinjiang? Yes, it certainly is. What can we, the United States, do about that? That I don't have a very clear answer on right now. So that sort of is a bit of context for the question of, is Joe Biden going to be a so-called realist? I think the term is a little bit unrealistic, but a so-called realist or a so-called values-driven president? I would say both. And it will be very difficult to figure out exactly how to craft a policy that blends these two strands. But I do feel very confident that he will be trying to blend them.
Matt, I think, I don't know if we've talked enough about China. I always feel that any conversation about China that doesn't include technology, and then by extension, if we're talking about technology infrastructure, there's also a conversation to be talked about vis-a-vis the manipulation of the public discourse, vis-a-vis Russia's involvement in large schemes or large alleged schemes of manipulating public discourse through social media. On that front, it's clear that during the 4 years of Trump, there was not a whole lot that was attended to on that front. Is the Biden administration going to be different? And again, I'm really interested in. I know that a couple of times, you've pointed to the fact that the dichotomy and the division might not be as stark as I seem to be making it. But for us here in Pakistan, we have this massive center blob, between Prime Minister Khan and Nawaz Sharif and Asif Ali Zardari. I honestly can't tell you what foundationally is different. Of course, it's different. When one's prime minister, the other are upset. And there are some legitimate policy differences, but essentially we have three mainstream parties in Pakistan, all of which are center-ish. One is a little more center-right, one is a little more center-left, but they're all in the center. So I think it's fascinating that the Democratic Party has as loud a representation from the so-called left or the socialist wing of the party. And that's why I keep going back to the term progressive. So please forgive me for that. But talk to me about this, the technology and the social media thing, and how Biden might contest what China and Russia are doing on that front.
No, I think, and this actually relates to your previous question and to Jonah's comments, because I think, yes, there's been a lot of attention paid, quite rightly, to Russian election interference and Russia's manipulation of social media and China's increasing use of technology. But again, they are, as others have noted, and I think it's very important to note, they are working to kind of, they're working to worsen tensions that already exist in American politics. They have not created these tensions. They are exploiting them. And I think it's important to move beyond even countries that we see as adversaries. I mean, there are, partners and allies that similarly are using some of these technologies to impact American politics and the American policy discussion. I think it's important to look at the way, countries broadly are using social media. I think a Biden administration will look, much more closely at things like Facebook, the way that the Facebook algorithm, as we've seen tragically in so many places, Myanmar being one of the very worst, in a way that Facebook's algorithm, which promotes engagement on the basis of fear and grievance, is actually contributing to actual violence in the real world. There's really no question about this. But I think this also, you had mentioned Bolsonaro, Orban. Senator Sanders wrote a piece in of September 2018 and gave a speech at Johns Hopkins University in October of 2018, focusing on this issue of the rise in global authoritarian axis, in which he grouped, Bolsonaro, Orban. He talked about China's role in this. He talked about even Netanyahu and some of the Modi in India. And some of the commonalities we see here of kind of these rising illiberal leaders, some, acting in a democratic context, but promoting a very exclusivist and divisive vision of democracy, in a way that is challenging this idea of universality, of universal rights, a way of saying, promoting this idea of sovereignty against international interference. And Trump has been an ally in this. This is something he brought up in his speech at the UN, the idea that nations just make their own decisions, and other nations shouldn't interfere to promote human rights. And I think this is going to continue to be a core challenge for a Biden administration. But I think they do recognize that some of these, this rising authoritarianism is working together across borders. And so promoting this idea of real liberal democracy and human rights is something that the United States needs to get behind.
So, Matt, if I could ask you to just expand a little more, because one of the questions I have is, and this is longstanding, it's not simply a Biden issue. I think it's more of how we understand the role of the state and how we think about technology. This kind of all-consuming algorithm. I mean, Twitter, Facebook, they're roughly all the same. TikTok is different because it's just fun. There is hardly any politics, although eventually, I think the rhythm is going to get you. I think all platforms are eventually to trend towards the mean. Ultimately, the size of these companies and their ability to control is a question that regulators are going to have to push. We've seen the beginnings of that in Europe. I think Europe's been a lot more robust in terms of what it wants, but I still don't think we've gone as far as maybe the way we were, once upon a time in the US, the breakup of the telco sort of, monopoly into baby bells. Is there any hint within the discourse, whether progressive or beyond, of the next administration seriously considering something more robust than, a couple of congressional hearings once in a while?
Yeah.
As far as Facebook in particular, Google.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to that with really any specificity, but I do know that this discussion is coming up very quickly, at least in the kind of in the policy world. Certainly in the journalism, among journalists have been covering this, policy professionals have been covering this, and we saw this during just this last campaign, the idea that Facebook finally decides to limit certain messages. I mean, who elected this 30-something multi-billionaire as one of the most important gatekeepers in American politics? This is not democratic. There's an understanding that when these companies have such influence, that government does have a legitimate interest in regulating them much more strictly. So I do think this is coming up.
But as I just mentioned, Robin, with Europe kind of being a little bit ahead of the curve on this, but of course Europe itself going through its own evolution. I want to talk a little bit with all three of you now about Europe. One of the interesting things that I really enjoyed was the Irishness of Joe Biden, and there was a really great clip of him. The BBC asked him something about the BBC, and he said, "The BBC, I'm Irish." And then there was speculation about whether Prime Minister Martin came before Prime Minister Johnson in the list of foreign leaders that were talked to on the phone. Of course, the Ireland-UK thing is a small subtext within the larger frame of UK's departure from the European Union, and a very interesting kind of neo-centrism that we're seeing in France. As a Muslim, for me, beyond interesting. But we don't want to get into that. Europe's dynamics are changing really fast, and I think Europe sees itself in many ways as a bridge between the West and China in some cases, and it sees itself as a victim of China in others. To what extent is Biden's approach to Europe going to be able to afford to be old Europe and old US, kind of the old NATO version? And has Trump done enough for it to be disrupted to the extent that we'll see new emphases and new accents within the US-Europe relationship or relationships?
Again, another very good question, Musharraf. I think, as I see it, and again, Jonah is much more intimately familiar with President-elect Biden's personality and personal views, but I think he does see as a priority reestablishing the transatlantic relationship, and that's pretty clear. As you say, the Irish part is a small one, but he did use it in the Brexit argument. Don't mess up the agreement with Northern Ireland in your Brexit decisions. But so I think he does see it as important. I think in the course of the last administration, but also the last decade, Europe has begun to feel that it needs more independence from the United States and needs to look after itself and its own interests, which will be perhaps slightly different from those of the United States. So I think that's been going on, certainly accelerated in the Trump administration when he was so rough on NATO and the Europeans and criticizing them for not paying their way and, living the life of Riley while we were defending them and blah, blah, blah. So I think, but I do think that they are emerging as a bloc that feels a bit more co-equal with the United States. That's not necessarily bad. I mean, I think that's fine. And you're right that they would like to position themselves, and I think this is smart on their part, is as a bit of a bridge, because their interests are slightly different when it comes to China or Russia in terms of their economic needs and so on. But I think what the Biden administration will do, and this I'm coming back to a common theme here, is that they will be professional in looking at the issues as honestly as they can to figure a way forward. And that frankly is about as good as it gets. Because these are challenging issues for everybody. Everybody's readjusting their place in the universe, including the United States. So, I think it'll be interesting to watch the way forward.
Absolutely. I mean, you talked about things where the U.S. and Europe have different interests, and the one place you didn't mention was Iran, where clearly the Europeans have tended to be a lot more open to Iran and its regime than the American center. I want to link two things together, and I don't think it's particularly unfair because I think that the Middle East and the U.S. relationship with the Middle East writ large, but particularly with Israel, helps inform its position on Iran and vice versa. I think the Israelis tend to see whatever happens between the U.S. and other Middle Eastern countries, particularly Iran, as informants of their standing in Washington and with the American establishment. Jonah, we keep talking about the traditional, we've used so many words: realist, centrist, competent. We haven't used that word, but that's what I think, are saying essentially, that this is a return to competence. I want to challenge that a little bit, not because I doubt that, because I know with people like you and I know how deeply you helped inform, the Obama administration's views, even on Pakistan. And I think that's probably a different conversation than the one we're having today. But I don't know if that competence is relevant anymore because the world has changed so much. The voter in 2008 is 12 years older now. The American Jewish community is not a coherent whole that is entirely pro-Israel all the time. There are progressives, there are hardcore evangelical type conservatives, there are people who love the idea of Jerusalem as the capital, and there are many who are aghast, perhaps more so than I am at that. Where will the Biden administration be? I mean, what is the mean here in terms of Israel and Iran? Because surely it's not going to be they come in and flip the switch on Iran and retract the decision on Jerusalem. But do talk about. So here's the straight question: what are they going to do with Iran? Are they going to renew the deal? And maybe as importantly, is Jerusalem going to continue to be the home to the U.S. embassy in Israel?
A lot of things there put in one category. So let me try to take a few parts where I'm more competent to discuss. And I think that the issue of the changing relationship between the U.S. and Israel is a fascinating and very important one, but one that Matt may be better equipped to address than I am, because he's been very out in front on this, and so has his boss. And more power to him, because this is a discussion that really needs to be had in American circles and is being had. So let me get back a little more to the ones where that are a little bit more in my wheelhouse. I think competence really does matter, because so much of the past 4 years has been not merely the result of bad policy, but the result of no policy. I don't even think that there is such a thing as Trumpism. I think there is just a big ball of grievances and personal whim and, to be honest, ignorance. And that leaves friends, allies, and adversaries scrambling to figure out what happens next. And whatever happens with Joe Biden, it won't be that. It will be an actual set of policies come up with by people who actually know what they're talking about, and observers will be free to accept them or reject them, but at least they'll sort of know what they are. They won't be just sort of trying to nail Jello to a wall. And when it comes to Iran, for example, Joe Biden has been pretty forthright that he's going to be trying to get into an improved version of the Iran nuclear deal. It'll be difficult. But he's been very clear that's what he wants to do, and it's very clearly the right thing to do. When it comes to the growing schism between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and even between Sunni and Shia Islam, this is something that really does need some expertise. And we saw in the debate where Joe Biden, he took some heat for saying in response to a question that something might happen, inshallah. I can, I think, take a little bit of either credit or blame for that, since when I was staffing him, I was always saying that. I came to Washington directly from Pakistan, where I'd been living at the time. So, as your listeners in Pakistan will be aware of, that when you say inshallah, it is an acknowledgement that we humans try our best, but we can only control certain things. And to me, that humility is going to be a hallmark of the Joe Biden presidency.
You'd think, Dr. Blank and Matt, you'd think that sitting on this side of the Atlantic and this far away from the Atlantic, one would be grateful and excited about the kind of the incoming competence and the humility. But I think with competence and humility, as we learned in the Obama years, also comes vulnerability to momentum and also likelihood of inertia. On Matt, what are the kind of core issues that progressives will litmus test the Biden administration on, where something absolutely has to happen?
Well, I do think, let's stay on Iran for a moment. I think the commitment to rejoin the JCPOA, and just as importantly, if not more importantly, just seek a broader diplomatic engagement with Iran, it was an early and very clear commitment by Vice President Biden. It was shared by all the Democratic candidates. My boss had been very out front in supporting, first of all, the Iran nuclear agreement, opposing Trump's withdrawal, declaring the intention to rejoin it and seek diplomacy with Iran and de-escalate tension in the region as much as possible. And I do think the way in which a Biden administration goes about pursuing that diplomacy, both in terms of managing the debate in Washington, I think we see opponents of the nuclear agreement and the kind of hawkish contingent in Washington already organizing very aggressively, to put roadblocks in the way of that diplomacy. We certainly see some partners in the region like Israel, the UAE, the Saudis, and others opposing and doing their own thing, working quite explicitly and frankly unprecedented, in my view, the way they're speaking openly about working with Secretary Pompeo to just impose and pile on new sanctions explicitly for the purpose of undermining the elected president's diplomacy. But I think a Biden administration is going to have a lot of support from progressive groups to pursue this diplomacy, and they will be watching, I think, very closely how a President Biden makes good on that commitment.
So clearly, Iran will be one of the tests. Are there others? I think for Pakistanis, Matt, Kashmir is going to be an important question. And again, I don't think anybody reasonably expects that the Americans will adopt the Pakistani position on Kashmir. But there has been a hesitation now that is at least 3 decades deep to engage at all.
Right.
Meanwhile, things have escalated there. So what is your view on that?
Yeah, I think one thing that I think progressives are going to want to see, but I think this has been, President-elect Biden has said this, is pushing back on Trump's, kind of abandonment of America's role in promoting human rights. I think, as you were discussing, I think with the others earlier in the discussion, there's going to be some level, I think, of tension, perhaps hypocrisy, in the way that the United States deals with different partners. These relationships are different. They operate in different contexts, but I think there will be an effort, and this is certainly something progressives would like to see, to bring some consistency and clarity to the United States standing for these ideas of universal human rights, pushing to uphold norms and conventions that the United States did such important work in establishing in the first place, along with our allies in the wake of World War II. So it's very hard to say exactly what that will look like with regard to Kashmir in particular, or any other number of other places we could name. But I think just having that clarity at the outset will be important.
Yes, and on the issue of Kashmir, I think that's a very good and important point to raise, of where competence matters, because we saw the opposite of that during this administration. And I think it was harmful for Pakistan, for India, and most of all for the people of Kashmir. We saw that when Prime Minister Imran Khan came to the White House, and Donald Trump lied in telling him that Indian Prime Minister Modi had asked him to mediate the Kashmir conflict. That was a lie. And Prime Minister Modi's office identified it as a lie. But it was a very harmful lie because Prime Minister Khan then was essentially forced to accept it as the truth and to raise false expectations for what the U.S. might do in Kashmir. The U.S. policy up until now has always been very consistent that the U.S. will facilitate but not mediate. I would be very surprised to see that change in the future. And I think that any president who wants to change it would have to really think long and hard because one of the hallmarks of a Biden administration, I feel quite confident, will be strong friendship for India and strong friendship for Pakistan. And I do not see a great likelihood of the U.S. mediating the Kashmir conflict. So when you have competent people running these things, you know not to get into a situation that just causes confusion. And as we've seen between India and Pakistan, one of the most dangerous things you can possibly have is confusion.
Ambassador Raphel, what is your view on this? You got to unmute yourself.
How did I
There you are.
suddenly?
Yep, you're
Okay.
back. You're back.
I didn't realize I'd muted myself. Look, I totally agree with Jonah on the competence point. You know, a competent administration and competent advisors would have prevented that whole business with Trump saying he'd been asked to mediate, and I totally agree on the chaos there, and I totally agree that it is not at all likely that a Biden administration would offer to mediate between India and Pakistan on Kashmir. I totally agree. But what I do think in this whole balance between realism and values, that it's possible that a Biden administration, after it deals with a lot of priority issues, will begin to signal to India quietly that what's going on in Kashmir really is not consistent with the values that they profess, and certainly not consistent with our values. I think that has been absent, and it has allowed a certain misunderstanding in India as to how Americans really feel about what's going on in Kashmir. So I think that as a starting point is really important, and I expect that will occur under a Biden administration.
All right, I want to wrap up with, and I usually don't do this, but I think it'll be fun to hear predictions for at least 2 or 3 key offices. It's been such a rich discussion. I thought we would dumb it down a little bit. Maybe start, Matt, with you. We're hearing Tony Blinken as a key candidate, Susan Rice, but one name that I heard that I think a progressive would have views on is Mitt Romney as Secretary of State. So likelihood and reaction, Matt?
You know, I'm going to respectfully decline to play along here, but with regard to Senator Romney, I'll just say there are a lot of very well-qualified Democrats.
Sure. My suspicion is that President Biden, more than anyone else, or President-elect Biden, more than anyone else, will be conscious of the mandate that he has. And I really don't think, as I said earlier, I think this is a centrist president who will be very respectful of the fact that 70 million people voted for Trump for whatever reason they may have done so, and with no prejudice to the views of the 4 of us or anyone else. In that scenario, is it likely, Robin, that actually, let me ask Jonah that, and we'll end with Robin. But Jonah, to what extent in foreign policy do you see it likely that there'll be a lot of reaching across the aisle? One thing I speculated on is that Zalmay Khalilzad might continue for longer than we might anticipate, given the interest of continuity. But do respond to that and other sort of speculative thoughts you might have on the extent to which Republicans and Democrats are going to work together on foreign policy under a Biden administration.
Yeah, well, I will, like Matt, respectfully not enter a guessing game about any specific individual appointments. Uh, but I think that Joe Biden will definitely be trying to have a bipartisan foreign policy wherever possible. That's just who he is. He wants to do this. And the good news is, I think it's quite possible because in the foreign policy arena, there really isn't as much of a partisan split as domestically. Uh, I always, throughout my time in the Senate, worked very collaboratively with Republicans of all ideological stripes. Often, when both my boss and their boss very much disagreed on domestic issues, and where I, at a staff level, disagreed on individual issues. I think the most important thing, perhaps, to take away, though, because I always get asked this whenever the issue of India and Pakistan comes up, and I think it really is important to just keep on emphasizing it, is that Joe Biden genuinely considers himself and will try to be a good friend of India and a good friend of Pakistan, and does not see those things as being separate or as being irreconcilable. The reason I have to keep stressing this is that I've given God knows how many interviews that have somehow always ended up with either Joe Biden is a friend of Pakistan and therefore not a friend of India, or Joe Biden's friend of India and therefore not a friend of Pakistan. And I just want to knock that down because I think he's genuinely going to be trying to be a good friend to both countries.
Well, I hope you didn't get any hint of that kind of binarism in this conversation,
No,
Jonah.
not at all.
I think it's quite
Not at
given
all.
his depth of experience that's clear. It's also aligned with, again, with the kind of the place that the U.S. is at and where this administration will be at. Thank you, all three of you, so much for such a rich conversation. Before we finish off, Robin, just ask you to kind of wrap up and say a little bit about what you think is likely in terms of the robustness and the speed at which he'll move on foreign policy. Some people say foreign policy will not at all be a priority because of COVID-19 and because of domestic disharmony. I tend to disagree. I think that it's being who he is, foreign policy will be from day one as important to Joe Biden as COVID-19 will. What are your thoughts on that, and any other sort of reactions you have, please, Robin?
Well, I totally agree with you. Many presidents have come in wanting to focus on domestic policy and found themselves drawn into foreign policy immediately. So I think that's clearly the case. And I think one of the benefits of the kind of competence that Jonah has talked about is that President-elect Biden, can walk and chew gum at the same time. He can focus on both of these, and I'm sure that he will. And I also think there will be a return to what Foreign Service officers like myself were taught, from the day we walked in the State Department, which is that foreign policy, stops at the water's edge. There are debates internally, but we all follow the same policy once we're outside of America. And you can't do that, particularly in an era of social media and whatever information flow, perfectly. But I think there will be much more discipline in messaging. And I think that's really important to avoid the kind of confusion that Jonah's been talking about. And, remember, President-elect Biden had 2,000 people helping with the whole foreign policy formulation. So once the team is in place, and I think that will happen pretty quickly, they've been, I'm sure, vetting people. We all know who the top choices are for Secretary of State, for example, and the Pentagon and CIA. And I think despite the fact that they've been prevented from getting intelligence briefings and so on, these people are very well informed. And, 4 years ago isn't like 10 years ago or 20 years ago for people having been in government. So I have a certain confidence that it will move pretty quickly. Of course, undoing some of the damage and repositioning the United States in an appropriate role in the world will take some doing. But I really think it will, from the point of view of the administration, they'll move pretty quickly.
Well, I want to be disciplinarian, but I also think it's important to ask if Matt or Jonah have any additional thoughts that they wanted to share before we wrap up. Matt?
I mean, one thing I'll just say very briefly is, I think Biden has, foreign policy has been a huge part of his work for a very long time. So I would expect that to be a big part of his presidency from the very beginning. But I would also add that the outcome of the Georgia runoff, which could determine Democratic or Republican control of the Senate. In the case of Republicans maintaining control of the Senate, that could sort of, encourage Biden to focus on foreign policy even more, given the amount of authority that the president has on those issues if he's more constrained on domestic because of that.
So a lot rides on the South.
Yeah. I'll just say thank you, Mushar, for an excellent segment. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Robin. Been on a lot of TV interviews and webcast interviews, what have you, and I must say, it's refreshing to have an intelligent hour of conversation rather than shout fest. So thank you.
Thank you.
That's what we're trying to build here. I'm so grateful to Matt Duss, to you, Dr. Jonah Blank, to Ambassador Robin Raphel. This was really illuminating. I'm really grateful, and I hope that the viewers and listeners, as they may be, felt as enriched as I did. Thanks all the participants and everyone tuning in, and we'll be back real soon. Thanks again. Goodbye.